International Men's Day. But let me not get into talking too much. Ranako asked me to introduce myself. So I'll start off by saying I work with Ranako actually on the board of WeTalkingBois, and I think that's why he wanted me to share first. So I work on that amazing board that is really focused on providing spaces for men to explore this issue of masculinity and to explore ways that we could form healthy and positive relationships. I am from Trinidad and Tobago. I'm also on the board of the Coalition Against Domestic Violence. I am currently an Atlantic Fellow for Social and Economic Equity with the London School of Economics. And there, my work focuses on gender equality, in particular, equality within private spaces such as the home. Most of my work involves working with men and boys to end violence against women and girls. Thanks, Ranako.
Thank you so much, Kevin. And Marcus, I think you have just an amazing bio as well. So could you quickly share with us a bit of what your work and a bit about yourself?
Yeah, I think first I want to start by saying I was just awarded a master's in women and child abuse studies from London Metropolitan University, and this is the first platform where I'm actually declaring it for the first time. So it's kind of nice to say that. And it's kind of full circle because I was with Life in Leggings working with some young men right before I left for London. And now full circle at the end of my time here in the UK, I'm back doing work with Life in Leggings. So it's quite interesting to see that kind of relationship kind of flourish, change, move, navigate, and, just back where we are right here. So yeah, so that's just a little bit of my educational background. I've been part of the women's movement for about 13 years. My work looks at child sexual abuse. Most recent research is Indo-Caribbean male survivors of child sexual abuse. I was part of the national investigation into child abuse in state homes. So a lot of my work integrates identities, race, class, ethnicity with issues of child abuse and violence against women. So yeah.
Yeah, and I think you guys, both of you mentioned an important point around work regarding masculinities and the involvement of men and boys, even as, because reality is we understand, you understand where the position of men, and as Kevin would have mentioned, today's International Men's Day, but very easily you can consider every day to be a man's day simply because of patriarchy. So could we start with Marcus? If you were to not necessarily give an academic definition, but if you were to give a very realistic example, breaking it down, what would you describe patriarchy and how would you describe patriarchy?
Yeah, I always describe patriarchy as a social governing system. It's a sort of a system that sits at the top of ideologies, institutions, interpersonal relationships, personal relationships. It sits at the top of how we develop laws, how we raise boys and girls, how we intervene in politics, the economy, even pandemics, right? So to me, it's a governing system that puts men at a position of privilege, right, over women and other men. So particular kinds of men sit at the top of these positions of power that dictate the way in which these multiple levels of existence, which is the ideological, the institutional, etc., how they function and how women become part of that system where they are seen as less valuable, less involved as particular kinds of men, as well as some men also falling into that category of not at that governing stage. Yeah.
So Kevin on mute his mic, so I'm not sure if he wants to jump in. So
yeah, of course, yeah. So yeah, to add to Marcus, I think it's important to center that that broad principle of patriarchy, because patriarchy would have many definitions. You go into the academic literature and you see multiple definitions, but what is common and what is the principle of patriarchy is that men are in control. And men are in control in private spaces, such as the home, and men are in control in public spaces, right? And often in the Caribbean, you know, that control in this private space, it may not always be a very straightforward thing, you know, because you see in private spaces, women being in control of, you know, the finances, managing the finances, women being in control of managing how the family spends time. But interestingly, in 2019, a research done by the UN Women across about 5 Caribbean countries showed that in those countries, 2/3 of the respondents said that they believe, all of whom were women, they believe that men ought to have the final say in decision-making in the home. So we see even in the system of patriarchy, in the system where men are in control and women are subordinated, you know, the literature would say oppressed, even women, some women, because that ideology that Marcus was mentioning is so internalized that even women are defenders and reproducers of such a system like that. But like I said, that broad principle is that men are in control.
Yep, I know Marcus would have mentioned, he would have mentioned or alluded to a certain type of male within the patriarchal system. Could you elaborate on that a bit more in terms of
yes, no, so we, just to make it clear, we talk about the patriarchy as a system, not a particular individual, but those systems are controlled or reproduced or understood in now what we look at as in the male and particular kinds of gendered elements of how patriarchy shows itself. And we're starting to talk about now masculinities, right? And we're starting to see how there are particular kinds of social traits and characteristics and behaviors that are usually associated with the most valuable of a kind of man, which we call the hegemonic masculinity, which is the most absolute respected of men in particular circles and spaces, because that's why it's called masculinities. It's multiple. So we have to see that in society, we put a particular kind of value on men, and we talk about this man. And you know, if you do this act, if you ask young people what it is to be, you know, this what does society want from a man? What do they expect from him? You talk about the breadwinner. They talk about a particular kind of look. They talk about particular kinds of sexual accomplishments, having multiple women, and more and also heterosexual. So we respect and value a man who fills these particular checklist of characteristics in a particular space, in a particular culture, in a particular society. And we have to understand that they exist in different spaces, because in my work, when I look at Indo-Caribbean masculinities, there are particular kinds of Indian men that are respected more than other kinds of Indo men. And then if we looked at the larger Caribbean context, Indian men are always in negotiation with other kinds of masculinities, other kinds of Afro-Caribbean masculinities, white masculinities, etc. So we have to see the idea of patriarchy being run and ruled and in favor of this hegemonic man, this absolute respected man, and those characteristics that comes with it.
Yep, and I think that's also an excellent transition point in terms of, you know, you mentioned these characteristics, and very much often these characteristics are, you know, they're essentially brought together into what we usually refer to as a man box. So if we were to unpack the man box, or if we were to open this, you know, if we were to have a physical box and saying that it was the man box, what sort of characteristics, what sort of behaviors, what sort of agendas would we find in this man box? We could start with you, Kevin.
Sure, thanks. And yeah, the man box really represents those sort of rules that are meant to keep men in check, those beliefs that put this awesome pressure on men and boys. You know, we often say that most men live their lives in pursuit, you know, in this kind of elusive pursuit to be the real man. And that real man is what Marcus was referring to before as a hegemonic, or the what is preferred or what is idealized in society. And that's really what that man box is. It's these sets of expectations around being tough and being strong and always having control of your emotions and, you know, having multiple sexual partners, being the breadwinner, using violence to solve problems, dominating over women and dominating over other men. You know, and the thing about the man box, it reinforces that masculinity, what Marcus introduced into the conversation, that masculinity, it's really a homophobic expression, not a homophobic, sorry, a homosocial enactment, sorry, a homosocial enactment, meaning that men perform their masculinities for the approval of other men within the group, right? And that whole concept of the man box is held together by homophobia, right? And not just from the standpoint of the contempt for gay men, for example, not just by that. And if you think about the man box, if men begin to step out of those roles, some of the things that they would be called, the names they would be called would be homophobic references. But where I want to go with homophobia is understanding homophobia more deeply than just the contempt of gay men, but homophobia as a fear of oneself being gay. And I think that's really what homophobia does to police the behavior of men and boys. So because it makes men so fearful of being perceived as gay, we engage with the world in particular ways. So for example, you would hear if a man has to wear pink, a pink article of clothing, right? A pink article of clothing, he would usually announce, real men wear pink, because he has to position himself both as a real man, but at the same time to avoid any sort of homophobic backlash for doing something that steps out of the man box, because wearing pink is not something that, I'm not just taking a very simple example, wearing pink is not something that men do and boys do. So if you are going to wear pink, you have to sort of have this disclaimer that real men wear pink, you know, just as an example.
Yeah, and if we were to, you know, to stick on the in terms of homophobia, you know, you mentioned that, you know, basically, you know, you're essentially in this man box, you're essentially preventing yourself from being seen as gay, being seen as other gender identities. To what extent do you think that homophobic nature goes to? And also, does it to what extent does that go to when you're essentially preventing yourself from essentially expressing yourself? Because, you know, you're simply expressing yourself. And does that homophobia also include, for example, transphobia?
Yeah, so
that question?
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay, go ahead, Marcus, and I can come in after.
Well, I wasn't sure, but
Yeah.
go ahead, Kevin,
No,
as you're already on it.
All right, sure, no problem. Yeah. Yeah, so that concept and that feeling and that pressure of homophobia invades our lives, you know, and it affects all aspects of our relationship. So men would not, or they would not want other men to know that they engage in certain behaviors, right? So, or it would prevent them from engaging in certain behaviors. Childcare is another example, you know, and you would hear people say, well, leave that for the woman to do, you know. Boys in school would select certain subjects because it's perceived a particular way. Boys would do TD and they won't do home economics, generally speaking, right? Because there are many boys who choose to do home economics, but generally speaking, it would affect every decisions that men make on a day-to-day basis. So that concept of homophobia really limits us, you know, it restricts us from experiencing the full range of human emotions, for example. So certain emotions would be off limits, except, you know, of course, expressing anger, you know, because people will say, why are you crying? Are you a girl? You know, or other names, right? So Marcus, I could throw it over to you now.
Yeah, and those practical examples, Kevin, is exactly what we have to be thinking about as we think about homophobia, as well as sexism, because we have to see homophobia and sexism as part and parcel of the package that comes with the kinds of inequalities that we discuss now, as Kevin talked about homophobia being this kind of fear of men being unmasked, right? And what that unmasking is, it's actually proving that they're not man enough, which means that it's putting a devaluing on femininity. And that's where the sexism comes in, right? To not be man is to be woman, and to be woman is undervalued, right? And what we do is that we use violence and homophobia to put men and women back in their particular boxes, in their particular lines of binary, right? So the middle binary is homophobia and violence that keeps men masculine and keeps women feminine. So we have to see that homophobia and sexism. And I always argue that we cannot unpack those particular problems if we do not see the devaluing of womanhood and femininity, right? So, and again, when we understand that fundamental idea of devaluing of femininity, we see now how people who are born in particular sexes, when the gender identities shift or change or their expressions change, we see another kind of phobia. Most times we see it amongst trans persons and transphobia, because it's the absolute most visible form of disrespect to the masculine order and the celebratory aspect of femininity by what you were once born as male. So it's seen as this total disrespect to becoming a man and a total celebration of femininity. And transphobia is that reminder that no man should be celebrating femininity in this kind of way. Yeah.
And I think what's important for us to communicate to boys and to men and to women and girls is an important to break down these gendered roles and these gender divisions of traits, of human traits, into masculine and feminine, and to understand that life is best lived along this continuum, right? Where even if we were to say some things are masculine and some things are feminine, as a man and as a boy, it's possible to be able to move across that, or we should envision a world where it's safe to move across that continuum and experience these traits or live out these traits that were classically or traditionally called masculine and feminine. So you find now that there's even trouble in the concept of masculinity, you know, in that whole concept of having these collective ideals of what it means to be a man. There's trouble in saying, well, okay, let's redefine masculinity from away from this toxic masculinity to now a healthy masculinity, because what we're really doing is saying, okay, come out of this box and come into this box. And what we really want to do is liberate all men and boys for them to be able to experience a full range of life. You know, so, I mean, some persons like Dr. Michael Flood have been, you know, years now, have been speaking about moving away from masculinity, the idea of masculinity and healthy masculinity or positive masculinity, and the different versions of good masculinity, to what we can see as an ethical selfhood. You know, being the best you, the best version of you as a human being, regardless of what gender you may find yourself in or identify with, being the best version of you. Send it over to you, Ranako.
Yeah, I think before we further the discussion, because we're just smoothly highlighting some crucial elements, and just going to remind those in the audience to feel free to ask any question. If you want to unmute your mic and ask the question, you could just raise your hand, and you could also put it in the chat as well, because we would allow questions to be rolling through as we discuss, as we continue in the discussion and the conversation. You know, one of the words that we've been constantly hearing for the entire evening is masculinity. We come from a very diverse region, you know, where there's slight differences in culture. For the most part, there's some similarities. But if you were to give a description, or if you were to generally illustrate what, for example, Caribbean masculinity would be, I know Kevin's from Trinidad, Marcus, you're also from Trinidad, but you would have studied in England, you would have studied in London. Again, you know, describing or illustrating what Caribbean masculinities may be, and then kind of pointing some differences that you both would have seen in your work in the Caribbean, in your work internationally regarding the masculinities.
Yeah, let me go first quickly, just because in my work, I do focus specifically on race and masculinity, and I do look at Indo-Caribbean masculinity. We know that Trinidad, last consensus was like about 41% of the Trinidad population is Indo-Caribbean. We know that there are large populations of Indo-Caribbean in Guyana, Suriname, and small pockets in Jamaica, etc. You know, so we do understand that there are different kinds of masculines that exist. We do have a history of Syrian masculinities in the Caribbean, Chinese, Afro-Caribbean. We do know that there are other kinds of masculinities that existed. Now, what makes Caribbean masculinity unique is that we have a post-colonial heritage. One, meaning that we come from a sector. We come with a history of slavery and indentureship rooted in our social systems, right? So we were all ancestors of a particular kind of movement from our grandmother land, right? So that, and then we were conditioned and gender socialized through colonial ideas of manhood, power, etc. Right? So colonial patriarchy shaped the idea of Caribbean masculinity. Of course, coming with that would have been its unique ideas of Indian identities coming from Indian indentureship, which I do see in my work. Now, if we go back to your first question, asking about some of the problems that these masculinities may cause, for example, what homophobia and transphobia might cause, there's a number of issues, such as a number one, one of the biggest ones is help-seeking behaviors. So in my work with Indo-Caribbean male survivors of child sexual abuse, we see how failing masculinity, whether it's measured in a Caribbean context, whether it's measured in a hegemonic Indian context, if you're in a Indian home, Indian community, etc., what happens is that the failing of that idea of masculinity puts boys and men in a situation of silence, right? They negotiate help, seeking help, disclosing their issue of child sexual abuse as a way of maintaining a particular kind of image and identity, which is one that is not rooted in victimhood, because victimhood and being sexually abused, penetrative, or even involved sexually with a man being abused puts them in positions of femininity, because to be penetrated is to be feminized. To be in a relationship, to be in sexual relations with a man, again, is a very feminized thing. Only women should want to be with men. And what happens is that society shifts the feeling of talking about abuse and seeking help onto issues about losing your masculine status, not being powerful, not being able to run away, not being able to fight it off, or shifts the conversation onto sexuality. Again, removing the core issue, which is this child sexual abuse. So young boys and men do not disclose or tell their story or seek help especially until later years, because of this notion of masculinity and maintaining the man box that we earlier described.
Yeah, and I think, because so for example, here in Barbados, Kevin kind of mentioned this part, and I guess this is kind of universal to Trinidad and Barbados as well. One of the things is having, having a lot of sexual partners, in straightforwardly put, having more than one girl, just having more than one girl, you have options, right? So is that something that is similar in Trinidad? Another thing that we have here as well too, Kevin accurately hinted at some of these things, but it just wanted to see how is it unpacked, or how is it displayed across the Caribbean, across the world. Another one of the things is very much real. And I actually remember having facilitating a session in school, and we were discussing consent, and a student made it very clear that this is his girl, and because this is his girl, he gonna know where she is. So, you know, and he has to know where she is constantly. And if she don't answer the phone, the repercussions that may come afterwards. Are these some of the things that we're seeing um, across the Caribbean, across the world?
You know,
Okay.
I remember, just a quick story. I remember in one of the classes I was teaching at UWI, Men and Masculinities in Caribbean, one of the young boys was saying how, um, in his mind, he shouldn't wash his bottom because nothing should be happening around that area. So we see how even those subtle, those ideologies are wrong, anus and anal penetration and the body shapes how men see themselves as strong, weak, as alphas, as sexual beings, and what is allowed and not allowed. So you have this young man now at entering university telling you that he wouldn't wash his bottom because it's around the anus, and we see that even trickling into older men who are supposed to get prostate exams, right? And the fear around prostate exams because it emasculates men, and the fear of femininity and the fear of being feminized continue to be sole problem to why men don't seek help around prostate care.
Yeah, I think I saw somebody put something in the chat really quickly. Yes. Um, Ranako post, and I think that's a really good example as well. In the height of the Me Too movement, when Terry Crews would have disclosed that he would have been sexually assaulted, and I think even a lot of his story that would have happened in his childhood and a lot of childhood trauma that he would have received, and as she accurately notes, Terry Crews is seen as the man. If this is the man in terms of characteristics, and all these different things. So Kevin, is there any specific behaviors that you would have seen in your work, anything that pops out in terms of masculinity?
Sure. And I'm looking down at my notes and I see I see an asterisk by Tell the Banana Story, right? So the banana story, this is a true story, really shows that connection across the Caribbean in how we conceptualize masculinity. It was a huge learning for me. So earlier this year, I had the opportunity to participate on a leadership development program as a mentor with young people, adolescent boys and girls from across the Caribbean. It was an amazing opportunity. Suriname, Guyana, Trinidad, Barbados, Dominica, Grenada, Jamaica, the Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, across the Caribbean, right? I'm probably forgetting one or two, but across the Caribbean. So boys and girls, adolescents, 16 to 18 or 19. And like I said, my role was mentor. So, we lived kind of dorm style. So every morning we would go for breakfast. I mean, you sit where you want, but often the countries kind of sit together. So I'm having my breakfast. I take my breakfast. I'm going back to sit with the Trinidad group, a group of boys and girls, adolescent teenagers. And, we eating breakfast, everyone is talking, and I have a banana. I begin to peel my banana and eat my banana, right? Because I need my daily potassium. One of the boys started to look at me funny, and he's like, so I'm watching him, and I'm like, what happened? He's like, sir, don't do that. No, don't do that. So I was like, what are you talking about? He's like, the way you're eating that banana, don't eat the banana so, right? And he's very clear about it. So it's like, what's wrong? It's like, that's not the way to eat a banana. So I was like, how do you eat a banana? And he's like, so you had to break it off into chunks and put the chunks to your mouth. The way you eat in that banana, please do eat that banana. So I began to ask the other young men in the group, like, what's up with that? It's at all Trinidad group, right? And it's like, yeah, so you can't eat a banana like that, That is not how you eat a banana. I mean, people will watch you funny, so people watch you trust us. Trust us. People watch you funny, do eat the banana like that. Right? And they are serious, eh? It's not a joke, they are serious. They do not want me to eat this banana like that. They say, nah, sir, that is just break out the banana now. So I was like, is this what you do as well? So they're like, yeah. if we're in school and we eat a banana like that, people laughing at us, they don't want to talk to us, they isolating us. I mean, if you're home, you could eat a banana how you want. But you see, if you're around your fellas, your boys, you can't eat a banana like that. So I was like, wow, I didn't know this. So I said, let me go and ask the other groups, right? And I deliberately asked them individually because I didn't want to bring all of them together, to ask them that, because I know, like I said before, masculinity is a homosocial enactment. So if I bring boys in a group and I ask a question, chances are they will all answer, you know, what each other thinks they should answer, right? So I went to the group from Suriname and I asked them about, you know, eating a banana. And they had the same experience. They're like, no. And they started to share. One boy was like, a time I was eating a banana like that, and none of my friends would talk to me for the day. I went to the group in Guyana, same thing. The Eastern Caribbean was as a group. So the boy from Bahamas, Antigua and Barbuda, they expressed the same thing. Jamaica was even worse, right? Because they kind of got real agitated around and kind of violent in their expression and aggressive in their expression about eating a banana. And you can see from this story how a simple thing from that experience, from a simple thing such as eating a banana, became something that was wrapped up in this whole idea of homophobia and being seen a particular way as a man, right? Now, it was really interesting that many of them said they could do what you want at home, in private spaces where no one is seeing you, but in public, you have to perform your masculinity, which even includes eating bananas, a particular way. And I think across the Caribbean, masculinity, therefore, is defined not in very positive terms. And by positive terms, I mean not in terms of masculinity is X, Y, and Z, but in negative terms, in the sense that masculinity, in its essence, is just not being a woman, as Marcus said, not being a woman. So therefore, masculinity across the Caribbean is wrapped up in this anti-feminine sort of expression. We don't know what masculinity is, but what we know is not being a woman. So whatever you do, don't do anything or don't appear in any way to be feminine. I think that banana story really captures that thread of masculinity that runs across the Caribbean, because boys will grow up to be men and will carry these ideals and similar values and attitudes with them.
Yeah, I think it's one of the things that you mentioned in terms of, you know, the level of not necessarily full-on violence, but how it was like, you know, in many cases replicated that this is something you definitely do not do. And it really just shows how connected, for example, masculinity is very much deeply, to a certain extent, embedded in violence. So, but before we go on, I see Ronald has a question. So Ronald, go ahead.
I don't really have a question so much, so I just wanted to add to the point. What Kevin was talking about was reminding me of things that cisgendered heterosexual guys would do to reinforce, you know, their masculinity for the space. So one of the things that I would have been made aware of that I did not really pay attention to, but, you know, in the context of gender, when you become aware of these things, it's hard to unsee it, right? So there's something called, the terminology is missing me right now, but essentially when you get into a space, a public space, as a man, you can't sit down directly next to a man. You're supposed to leave a space. I did not know this was a thing, you know, and it was heavily policed. Like, even if you don't study it in us, or you just get in, let's say, a public vehicle, a bus, and you just sit down next to a man, there are men who would prefer to stand up. There are enough seats available, but if a man is in that seat, they would stand up because you're supposed to leave a space, right? And if they do sit down, because, you know, let's say the feet killing them, or if they just want to sit down, they would put a space between them and the man where they're hanging off the chair because they don't want to be touching the man. They don't want to be seen as gay. You know, it's in public transportation, we all going where we're supposed to be going. I ain't studying you. I ain't trying to police your masculinity. I'm just trying to get where I'm going. And you're making it so awkward inside this space because you're trying to perform that you're straight for everybody else. And let's say for you as a guy, you're not even studying it. The guy next to you is checking you because he don't want you up next to him because if he allow it, he may be seen as gay. So it's crazy to me. It reminded me of those things and the other things that's more common, like for example, a man just expressing like his moment of vulnerability to another man, how he appreciates him, how he loves him, or how he cares to him, and he gonna say no homo at the end of it, So that's just my tweets.
Yeah, and before we invite your next contribution, you reminded me of a story when I call public transportation, and realistically speaking, public transportation, it's a given that at some point somebody may just touch you or hit you, or it's just given. And I remember this thing, and for what I guess maybe because of the angle that the van was turning out, and the guy that was in next to me, his foot touched me, and his reaction was like, okay, your foot just touched me. The angle is turning. You're going to thing it because basically his foot hit me, and his reaction was like, whoa! His spring reaction was to literally push himself against the other thing. I was like, but you're in public transportation. The turn of the angle, it really, really, it has nothing to do with anything. You're just came into contact because of how public transportation works. So that reminded me of that. I found that funny. So Kendra, I hope I'm pronouncing your name right. Just a little disclaimer, I'm not the best at names.
It's fine. You pronounced it correctly. But just to add, hi. Well, first of all, hi. My name is Kendra Bees. I'm from Antigua and Barbuda. Just to add to the conversation that I'm enjoying so far, and piggybacking off of what Kevin was speaking about, it reminds me of the sociologist Irving Goffman, who said, "Life is a play." And when you're outside of your home, you're on the front stage. And then when you're inside your home, you're on the backstage. And in the backstage, you really show who you are. And on the front stage, you're performing for society to be accepted. And I think that pretty much sums up what it is in the Caribbean, where masculinity is everything that is not deemed to be homophobic. You have to, or anything that you have to perform in a way that is not feminine. You can't act in a way that is feminine. You can't speak in a way that is feminine. I know, I've lived it. I have a soft voice. My voice didn't break, as they would say. So in terms of that, I've always been told I speak like a woman. So for me, it has been my life. So when you guys are speaking about it, it rings home to me. And I think why this movement is important is to show that these simple things don't necessarily define who men are or who they're going to become. All of us are made different. All of us have our unique characteristics and our traits that makes us one in the same. And I think once we continue to push that message and educate persons that they're okay, and you determine your outcome in life, you have the ability to choose who you want to be, I think we will go a long way.
Sure, I was looking at the chat. Thank you so much, Kendra, for that contribution. I think that's a very valid contribution. And I think one of the things that we spoke about some of the bad elements of masculinity. Are they, Kevin, Marcus, would you say they're good elements of masculinity? And what are some of these good elements of masculinity that should be portrayed a bit more? And so Marcus, you can go ahead.
Oh yeah, just to also add to the public transport story, I remember Maximan telling me don't sit in front, so not even touching him. This is a big maxi, and he was saying he's only let women sit down in the front, which just I have to point out that part of masculinity, part of the masculine status is again the amount of women and how your interaction with women are. So some of these maxi men, in order to earn masculine points, need to have this pretty woman in the front seat, etc., etc. And we see how that starts to create a failing idea of intimacy for men and men, right? Because the only kind of intimacy men are allowed to have is sexual accomplishments with women, right? But they're not allowed to be affectionate, etc., etc. So I think those are excellent pieces. So the question is, remind me the question again.
Yeah, so I was asking, sorry, because you brought, so before we ask the question again, because you brought out a piece that was brought to my attention, and you talked about the whole intimacy. I'm not sure if everybody watches The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. I hope that is not an aging factor, but you know, he essentially spoke to that, and he spoke to the in terms of the level of intimacy. Because the reality is sometimes, and then being very frank, sometimes we as men, we probably just need a hug, and that's just reality. But as you mentioned, having to be limited to portray a level of intimacy in one activity or around one activity, I think that has not done us any favors at all. So I was asking in terms of the more positive masculinity traits, or the more the traits that we should be hoping or seeking to promote and empower more.
Yeah, so I always tell people the usual traits that are synonymous with masculinity, like breadwinner, provider, protector, sporty, athletic looking, all of those things, those are not bad traits as they stand in their own right, you know. Those are not bad traits. What becomes problematic is these gender regimes when they're only synonymous with one particular sex, and we restrict others from doing particular things. And that's how we start to see it in law and policy and social exclusion. So you can't get into particular spaces if you act and look a particular way, right? So I think the issue isn't the characteristics, because the characteristics that are usually synonymous with femininity, like emotional, caregivers, nurturers, aren't problematic as well. Again, the problem with these gendered roles and expectations is the regime, is the fact that they should only be attainable by one sex. And to me, the question isn't about good masculinity and bad masculinity, and good femininity and bad femininity. It's about, what does raising boys to be masculine mean, right? If we raise boys to be emotionless, aggression, to be holders of the patriarchy, and to think that they're entitled to power, then those become problematic areas of masculinity. When we raise society to see femininity as weak, and other men who are who hold less social status and privilege to other men as weak men, then that becomes the problem with a masculine culture, right? When we start to create these binaries of who is powerful, who isn't, you know. So again, the characteristics usually aren't the bad thing. Again, I go back to say it is the regime.
Yeah, I think that is a very crucial point. I'm not sure, before I insert my comments, I'm not sure if Kevin wants to jump in.
Sure. Yeah, thanks. And I mean, this is what I appreciate about Life in Leggings, having a conversation like this on International Men's Day. Yeah, that we really get to unpack a lot of these issues about what it means to be a man on a day where many programs are ignoring the broader issues, those systemic issues that maintain an order, that gender order that Marcus is referring to. But it's really encouraging that Life in Leggings is putting the spotlight on having a conversation like this. So, I mean, the first thing I want to say is that masculinity doesn't equal men, right? Masculinity doesn't equal men. So oftentimes when we're talking about masculinity, some men become irritated, they feel offended, and they lash out, right? But when we're speaking about masculinity, like Marcus was pointing out, we're speaking about this gender order and how men are positioned and position themselves in relation to other men on this gender order. If we are talking about qualities, you know, I will go back to what I was mentioning at the start in terms of ethical selfhood, you know, so I won't even begin by talking about what concepts within masculinity are positive. Because, you know, if we're being honest, anything that we say can be ascribed to masculinity, you know, women can do it as well. What we're gonna say, being strong, being a breadwinner, you know, being resilient, you know, women can, or, you know, there's nothing that limits that to the domain of being a man, you know. So for me, in terms of qualities and traits, and I have 2 children. I have a boy and a girl. And, you know, it's important for me to teach them to be honest, you know, to teach them to take care of themselves, to know how to cross the road. So it's for me not about traits and so on, but I mean, I remember, if I reflect, I remember there was a time like when my daughter was born, I went to my son and I was like, okay, son, you know, we are the men in this house. We're supposed to protect this little girl. And I had to check myself. You know, I had to check myself because often that's what we project on boys, you know, and yeah, being protective is important, but you're not being protective because, you know, you're a man or a boy. You're being protective out of care, you know, and care is a commodity that we all can share in, right? Men and women, boys and girls. So for me, it's not pulling out from masculinity what are positives and separating them from negatives. For me, what I would like to achieve or see us work towards is just dismantling these divisions, you know, and allowing boys and girls, men and women, to be able to express themselves in their most authentic, in the most authentic way.
Yeah, so you both spoke about essentially dismantling and having an open discussion in terms of these various traits and as Marcus would have mentioned, the entire gender regime. So Marcus would have mentioned in terms of training a child. Kevin, you would have mentioned this dismantling. How should we go about this education, this dismantling? We start with Kevin. Kevin.
Yeah. Yeah. So the first question, I mean, and this was a question I had to ask myself first, right? So, I mean, the first part of the work is for men and boys because just the experience of masculinity is traumatizing, right? Growing up as a boy in a system, Marcus referred to that system of relations where violence is a central component. So masculinity is enforced and reinforced and policed through the use of violence. Growing up as a boy, we all face this level of trauma. So I think it's important that men begin their own journey of healing, right? That requires vulnerability, that requires safe spaces, that requires trusted individuals to support that transformation. You know, for me, the important question in beginning to dismantle is, do we need a concept of masculinity to be good men? Do I need, and I'm personalizing it now, do I need some shared collective ideas of what a man should be and shouldn't be in order to be a good man? You know, and I think that's where it starts. So a lot of reflection and inner work within groups of men and women, so as we begin to reflect on these ideas that we held on to so long, and some of us have believed and come to believe that, you know, these are natural things, you know, so questioning things that we have grown up with, all part of that healing process.
Marcus?
Yeah, so my work and across the board in terms of how it affects women, global majority groups, you know, and this includes, you know, migrant, LGBT folks, trans, you know, all of these groups. To me, what needs to happen is this culture of relinquishing power. It is rooted in patriarchy that then filters into masculinity and masculinities and manhood and boyhood in holding a particular kind of notion of power, which is I am, you know, man, I am powerful. So a huge part of that has to be an adoption of relinquishing power. And that's where I would start it. How do we as men relinquish power, create that culture of thinking about relinquishing power as a way to start seeing equity, equality, and sharing?
So, you know, in terms of dismantling and educating, you know, you mentioned various elements. You know, if I was to just, you know, if I was to just ask, feeding off of an author, if I was to basically ask, so then should we aim to raise feminist and pro-feminist sense? What would be your response? Should we just have a world with pro-feminist and feminist men globally? Would that solve the issue, in your opinion?
Pro-feminists, I believe, to be the start, not the end. The end is a space where all identities, all characteristics are celebrated for what they are. All persons have access to resources, and people can move freely across borders, etc., across public spaces. To me, that is more the end goal, right? But in terms of again, I mean, it is about I just lost my train of thought. Sorry. It is after 10 here. You have to after 11 here. You have to forgive me. What was the question again? I should have written it down.
Yeah, so I was basically asking, you know, should we raise
Pro-feminist men.
feminist and
Yeah,
feminist?
yeah. So pro-feminist men allow for us to start thinking about women's position in society. It allows for us to see what has happened to women historically, the now, and the work that is needed that was once in absence of men's involvement, right? Because men were the ones who created these systems, and they are usually the ones who reproduces it and call for its reproduction and its maintenance of it. So pro-feminist men allows for us to start thinking about men's role in a system of equality, a system of sharing, and understanding women and girls' experiences within these systems. So I think that we do need a culture of where young boys, men, think about how women are being affected in society, whether it be women in politics, women in wars, women in conflicts, women in street harassment. And that is usually the sort of call by feminists and women's groups. It is for men to start listening and thinking about how their continuation of holding on to the man box, the characteristics that make them man, continue to affect women and girls and femininity. So I think that is why I think that is the benefit of pro-feminist men, or just feminist men, or feminist thinking, right? Um, and who benefits from it? Yeah.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Hill.
Sure. Yeah, I like the question, Ranako, especially as a father of two young children. I won't say that I raising feminist children. I wouldn't say that, right? What I would say is that I hope that through modeling my life within private spaces and them seeing me in public spaces as well, they can see these characteristics that feminism has enabled me to pursue and work towards. Now, feminism as a concept is broader. It's broad. It's a single word, but it's very broad, and often has a bad rep across the Caribbean outside of academia, and sometimes within academic spaces too, right? But it often has a bad rep. Feminism is accused of things of mashing up the home, introducing homosexuality into our perfect Caribbean region. It gets a bad rep, but what feminism, the way I like to view feminism is like a toolbox, you know, and of all the toolboxes that there are, I find it the most suitable sets of tools to begin to look at issues, and Marcus mentioned it, issues of power and how we begin to share power and how we begin to work towards equality. I remember once being in a forum and a man was like, he stood up, we were talking about gender equality, and he stood up and he said, I'm all for gender equality, but I'm not a feminist, right? And everybody was in the room was like, well, how is that possible, right? Because, you know, but he was like adamant, and it was just the term that he just did not want to identify with the term. But the principles, he would agree with all of the principles. And I think it's similar in the Caribbean, where that term still needs, you know, work to break down in layman terms, to help the man and the woman on the street really understand what we are trying to communicate when we say feminism, when we say feminist children, when we say a feminist informed program, for example. What are we really saying, you know? And feminism really offers us the tools and the resources and builds our capacity to look at how structures reinforce inequalities through setting up gendered relations between men and other men, but also between men and women. It's a structure that keeps power intact, a power where men are always in control and women are subordinate. And feminism allows us to begin to look at that in a very critical way. So in terms of raising children, I think what's important would be raising critical thinkers, raising children who would be able to be willing to explore different ways of seeing the world and exposing them with opportunities for different ways of seeing the world before putting them in a box to say they're feminist children or any other term, right? But critical thinkers, so they eventually would begin to form their own view and perspective of the world.
Yeah, so just bringing it back to, as you know, because we understand that patriarchy is a power dynamic, as constantly been mentioned for the evening. We understand that that's an important element in transforming Caribbean masculinities. And we understand how that the implications of patriarchy, how that affects other men, women, and children. So what would you say is fragile masculinity, and how does that result in, for example, violence against men, violence against women, and violence against children? So we can start with you, Marcus.
Yeah, so masculinity is fragile, and we see this during other experiences of masculinity, such as the masculine crisis, which we see as one of the findings in feminist work around gender-based violence. When the pandemic happened, feminist groups and women's groups were paranoid for two, at least in the circles I am in, we were paranoid for two particular reasons: the increase of child sexual abuse and the increase in domestic violence. Because we knew that the pandemic wasn't going to allow men to be and women to be trapped with each other. Abusers will have always been abusers. Whether he goes out to work or not, he will still have abusive ideologies, right? What we were afraid of is that the loss of jobs, the inability to live up to the man box by being a provider, protector, etc., right, would have been challenged by the fall of the economic system because of COVID. So we saw that people were losing their jobs, men were being sent home, and domestic violence increased, right? Child sexual abuse is still to be counted, right? So we see how when masculinity is challenged, right, how violence becomes this women and children become an scapegoat to regain the power that they once lost as being a provider, being a breadwinner, etc. So so masculinity is fragile, right? The minute it is challenged or you lose a particular tick in your masculine checklist, you automatically go to the next thing, right? And women are perceived to be soft and weak, so they become easy prey, and children, right? So you replace that tick of masculine power and control by using women and children, and violence becomes the opportunity in which you regain that power. So the fragile masculinity is something that we have to discuss, and we have to also discuss how those masculine crises, right, impact women and children and other men. Right? Because the minute a man call you out, say something, you challenge your masculinity, you want to regain that by standing up for your pride, for your ego, for your rights, you know, in inverted commas. And that is because of a fragile masculinity. Yeah,
Yeah, I agree with Marcus. Masculinity is fragile. It's often held together by violence or the threat of violence. Its fragility is seen, for example, in our obsession with things such as, and I don't know if it's like this in Barbados, but we will have like radio talk shows in the morning talking about what would you do as a man if you're a woman making more money than you, right? Because again, your whole profile as a man, your whole sense of identity as a man is rooted in certain ideas, you know, being the breadwinner, earning the money, you know, and just the simple experience of a woman being matching you or even out earning you, you know, puts your whole life into a spin. Your whole identity is now questioned. I remember recently had a conversation with someone, and they were saying how you know, they're introducing gymnastics in this school where his son attends, right? And he was like, some of the parents were up in arms and saying, well, like, they want to raise gay boys, you know, by introducing gymnastics, you know, and it made me laugh because I reflected on the history of gymnastics, for example, that was only men, and women couldn't participate in that, or just sports in the whole, you know, but just how fragile, just how simple things will upend, you know, will unpin your whole identity as a man, you know. So while the patriarchy confers power to men in general, right? That's a general statement, right? Because we know not all men have power, although men have power in different species. But while the patriarchy confers this power, it is very fragile power. And because of that, we see violence is used to keep it intact. Violence against other men who may threaten that identity, and violence against women. So some people speak about compensatory violence, you know, where, as in the case of a woman earning more or a woman being more educated, men have to keep their woman in check. And some men do that through very violent means. And I'm not only speaking physical violence, but in terms of emotional violence, financial violence, in terms of controlling the money that a woman may make. So it's not only physical violence, but violence is meant, and it's a kind of compensatory violence to make up for where he believes his manhood or his masculinity is falling short, because his partner is now encroaching on some of these masculine domains that he ought to excel in.
And Kevin, just to add this, and we're going to see the rise in a kind of pro-feminist men thinking and fragile masculinity as we see the World Cup taking place in Qatar. We are going to see how the clashes of men who think about dismantling power, think about inclusivity, think about celebrating femininity, and we see in a space that holds men to a particular kind of regime. So, I mean, we have to watch out and kind of learn and see how that is going to unpack, etc. So I think this is an excellent, thing for us to kind of, these concepts to hold on to as we look at the world, as they start thinking about, subordinated men in sports, yeah.
Yeah, and I, just to, I see the hand raised, but just to, a point that Kevin mentioned, and I'm sure the other men in the chat could confirm it, if it's the same for them or not. But I mean, if I was to have a girlfriend, a wife, whatever, and they're making more money than me, I would happily be the one to stay home. That's just my opinion. But that it works with me. But Ranako, you can go ahead.
Not Ranako calling for some poor woman to come and meet her house husband, but okay. Marcus was talking. Actually, Kevin was talking. I remember I think it was last year, if I remember correctly, with the pandemic, time is just a concept that I've been struggling to get a foot in on. I remember when you commanded the man pledge, and you would think that the pledge was something that, it was so simple, things that we could agree on, that nobody would object to this, nobody would have an issue. And I was seeing a lot of men objecting because they felt like it was devaluing as a man. I mean, like, they could have might as well just come out and say, listen, telling me that I can't beat a woman, I need to respect a woman, I need to, not be violent. That's almost like emasculating me. And it was wild to see them say, but not say in such words, right? So I'll let Kevin speak to that, and also Marcus, and I guess what that reinforced you and what your perspective was on that.
Yeah, thanks for bringing back those memories, Ronel. Yeah, so the men's pledge was launched by Carryman a couple of years ago, I think, or last year. Marcus worked on it as well, because we wanted to make it as inclusive a process and participatory as a process as possible. It wasn't just the organization just developed this set of ideas and put it out and say. So we included lots of men and women in the conversation about practical ways that men can, in their everyday lives, contribute to reducing violence against women and girls. And yeah, I too was surprised at some of the resistance that some very, what I would think are common sense and very honorable things, the kind of resistance that it was getting. I remember within one of the focus groups, I remember there was this man. I saw he was doing some activism on Facebook around ending violence against women, and the news even interviewed him, I think, and he was talking about his daughter, and he don't want his daughter to grow up in a world where she would experience that kind of violence. So that's why he was doing this activism publicly, to just say end violence against women and girls. It was around a time in Trinidad where we were experiencing like back-to-back incidents of femicide, right? And I think it's important to say that women were being murdered at a rate that was troubling. It was upsetting the public generally. But that's not to say when these murders are not happening that women are not experiencing violence, right? So yeah, so I said, this is a person I should invite into the space to get his inputs on the pledge. And generally he had no objection with most of the pledge, but he was like, that one about not harassing women on the street, that one about catcalling. So you telling me I can't call a woman on the street, but that's my right to do that. And I was trying to explain to him, but women have been saying that they don't like to be harassed on the street. They feel threatened, they feel afraid, they just don't like it. And he's like, no, that's my right. And yeah, and he was really vocal about it. He was even saying, you know, how we were trying to change the world, and this is how, you know, men interact with women in Trinidad, and, you know, nothing is wrong with it. So it was really interesting, like Ronel was sharing, to see that kind of experience and that kind of resistance from some men. You know, some men adopted it and signed on, but some men just had a problem with it, and they were describing it as you know, and I was at the front of receiving some of those negative comments to, you know, like being pawns of feminist women, and being agents of feminism, and trying to undermine masculinity. And someone once told me on Facebook publicly, you know, like I gone against men.
I got it now.
I have a question. Why do you think it's, and either Marcus or Kevin can answer this, why do you think it's so hard for men to accept that, you know, other men could be fragile, other men could be like weak? Because I had an interesting conversation. So right now I'm in a fellowship called the Community Engagement Exchange, CEE. And just recently I had a conversation with one of the other fellows. It was a group of us around the table, and one of them, he's from Mali, and he could not accept the idea that a man could be raped, or the whole notion against, like, let's say something as simple as consent. So he felt as though once a woman said yes, she couldn't change her mind. But this is a whole different conversation. But just the whole notion around a man can be raped, he couldn't accept, because he felt as though once it's with a woman, it shouldn't be seen as rape.
Yeah, so I'll just go quickly. So one, in terms of men not being able to see the fragileness of other people and other men, is because of what Kevin talked about as homosocial enactment. Men are a group, and you know, they're only as strong as their weakest link. And if their weakest link is feminine, it means that all men are possibly going to be feminine too. So they don't want to be associated with that. And again, the patriarchy has given men this kind of privilege and power over women, over children, over other men. And they don't see themselves as being denied what was once an entitlement to them, which was women's bodies. You know, white men historically saw themselves as having power over black bodies, black and brown bodies. And to this day, some white men can't understand how a black or brown could be equal to them, right? And it's the same thing with men and women. Men can't understand how a woman could be seen as equal to them. Their job, whether it's from religious doctrines or social messaging, that women's role is to be is just there for men's pleasure, and women shouldn't have any say. So we see those reinforcements of just either white patriarchal order or just general men's patriarchal order when it comes to sexual entitlement. So it is, and it goes back to my fundamental way of challenging it. If men listen to how women experience walking the streets, how women experience engaging in sex, and how scary and unsafe and how unequal those playing grounds are, they will understand. And I would hope that they would understand why this work has to be done this way. But yeah, these are the reasons why men struggle to understand these resistance to patriarchal power and order.
Yeah, and from your question, Makesi, I am deducing that you're speaking about men being raped by women and not men being raped by other men, right? And I think that it was difficult for your colleague to see that a man could be raped by a woman, because in a very crude way, sex has been conceptualized as a means of conquest. You know, something that men do to others, you know, and to say that a man could be raped, meaning that somehow, you know, he could be conquered. And for someone to be conquered, it means that someone greater than him has to conquer him. And as Marcus shared, women are, within this patriarchal ideology, women are seen less than men. So it's impossible for a woman to conquer a man. So therefore, it's impossible. How, you know, it can't be conceived that a woman could rape a man. And it goes back to, you know, that conversation of consent as well. Do men give consent to have sex, or is it that a man is supposed to be always ready to have sex, you know, and women always available to men, you know? So it's just deconstructing those and having conversations like those that you're having with your colleague is, you know, a necessary first step. And it's something that, you know, many men are not going to just say, oh, right, yeah, I understand what you say. You know, people will take time to come around to these ideas. But it represents, you know, an important point in their life where they're introducing new ideas. So we have to keep having these conversations, even though it may seem like, you know, it's not being received positively.
Sorry, I was talking about my muted. Classical Zoom. So Casey, okay, yeah, that's just confirmation. That's just confirmation that the question was answered. So you know, as we begin to wrap up, Kevin, Marcus, what is some of the work that you're seeing in the Caribbean that is seeking to address transforming masculinities and kind of attempting to redefine the system of patriarchy? What is some of the work that you would wish to highlight, or some of the work that you both are doing in this element? You start with Kevin. You're muted, Kevin.
Yes, thanks, Ranako. Speaking about transformative, what did you say? Transformative.
Transforming
gender transformative approaches. I think that's really important when we're thinking about how we design programs. I observed this week a lot of the conversations around what's happening for International Men's Day, different activities and programs and initiatives. And a lot of them were about bringing together groups of men or boys in a space with a male facilitator, talking about the role that the man plays in the family and society, right? And it's, I think, you know, it's something that made me, you know, just quiver a little bit and recoil a little bit, because, you know, we are still there. We are still at a point where we are designing these programs for men and boys that are not gender transformative, but may reinforce some of these ideas that keep men and women in different positions of power. So speaking about gender transformative programs is something that is very important. And to have gender transformative programs means designing programs that consider those different roles, the different relations, the different norms around gender, and going forward to address these inequalities that exist between men and women and boys and girls. So, I mean, for example, you know, there's always this huge debate about should women be facilitators in programs that deal with men and boys. You know, and some people say, no, we can only have men. How can a woman come and speak to men and things like that? And I think it's important to really look at that and look at programs that that deconstruct. If I were to pinpoint one or two from Trinidad that I think are really positive programs, gender transformative, or with the potential to be gender transformative, I will highlight the She's Royal initiative that's being implemented by Queen's Royal College, which is an all boys, well, majority boys school, because they have girls in sixth form, I believe, but from 1 to 5, just boys only. And in that program, it's a good example of how we can have these conversations with children and young people around issues of masculinity and violence and power and privilege. It's a very intentional way to bring the conversation forward. And I believe that through programs like that, boys from an early age could begin to see how they are positioned in this gendered order, and begin, as Marcus was discussing, begin to think about how they can share power, you know, with women and with other men and boys, and how we can work towards a more gender equitable society and region. That's one I would share. There's another one that I know about. It's called Teens Tackle Gender-Based Violence. It's done by an organization that I'm doing some work with actually now, called Create Future Good in Trinidad. And it was a program that brought together men and women as facilitators, but also boys and girls as the participants from multiple communities, to begin to co-create strategies to deal with violence within their communities. It looked at the violence that they experience, but also forms of violence that they perpetrate. Because sometimes, you know, it's easy to talk about the violence that we experience, but sometimes we use a different measuring stick when we begin to think about the violence that we perpetrate and why we perpetrate harm and violence. So I found those two programs to be to have that potential to be gender transformative, as it broke down those divides and it allowed space to challenge stereotypes and norms, and to look deeply into why men are socialized certain way and why women are socialized certain way, and why we reproduce this generation after generation. I am always very cautious of these programs that bring together men only, and you have this dynamic male speaker at the front talking about men taking back their rightful place, men being the head of their homes. I'm always very cautious about those types of programs, because I see that, and I'm saying unintentionally, because I don't think anyone sets out to do this on purpose, but they reproduce these very traditional rules that keep women, again, in a place, right? That's a place of subordination, and it elevates men and boys to this place of leadership and this place of power. So great question, Ranako. I'm glad that it's included in the discussion. The need for gender transformative approaches across the Caribbean is something that should be centered.
Yeah, and just before, sorry, Marcus, just before you share your contribution, just a correction. And, you know, I just want to make that correction before we continue. I spoke about transforming, as you mentioned, transforming gender. I would have then said what the correction is, the second part of what I would say. Not to redefine patriarchy, but to eliminate it, to reduce it, to, you know, because we don't want to redefine patriarchy. I think we've done that time and time again over the last decade, over the last century. Dismantling it, remove, because we ultimately want to get to a point where we remove it. So there's just that correction. So over to you, Marcus.
Yeah, I'm glad that you corrected that, because patriarchy is a rejuvenating system. It will always find its way back into trying to give particular groups of people, including men, positions of power. It's just historically part of our social DNA. So I'm glad you said that. I just want to just add to Kevin's contribution that in these particular men's spaces, we also have to have spaces that does the work and the analysis and not appropriate the women's experiences as their own, right? I have always argued that I have spent several years looking at male survivors of child sexual abuse, and by no means is it to undermine the experiences of the number of girls and women that experience sexual abuse, but to call out the unique experiences that men face because of gendered ideas, ideologies, roles, and expectations. So as men, we have to do the work, we have to do due diligence and justice to men's experiences and not just claims women's experiences as equally our own, right? So we can't appropriate the women's experiences, but rather collectively think about our own, do the analysis necessary to see what are the core of our inequalities or our own experiences with injustice, right? So when we do that, we start to relinquish this idea that it's a battle of the sexes. It's not he versus she and she versus he, right? When we do the proper analysis. So I think that's really my go-to for the work that is being done in the Caribbean. It's about thinking about men's need for its own analysis, and it goes to my first project that points to good men and masculinity work, which was the 1996 conference done by Professor Ranako on Caribbean masculinities. Then the production of her book Interrogating Caribbean masculinities, which then led to a university course called Men and Masculinities in the Caribbean at the University of the West Indies. So we see how if you do the work, and I'll tell you this, this course allows for us to unpack patriarchy, homophobia, intimacy issues with men, violence, and that is violence against women, violence against other men, violence against themselves. So, if we do the work, we could see that there is a particular need for us to understand men and masculines, but we need to do the work, and the university has done that part. I'd also like to think that there's a number of individual men out there like myself, Kevin, Amilka, a group of men attached to Carry Men that are doing individual work in individual spaces, right? I have a pastor friend who's quite gender and pro-feminist informed and talks about religious trauma and pulpit shaming and what that does to particular groups of people, including women. So I'm seeing all of this work being done in large spaces and on individual spaces. So yeah, that's the kind of work that I have been exposed to, as well as the pushback. We can't deny that there's a lot of masculine backlash and pushback to this kind of work, because remember, at the end of the day, a lot of men who are ruled and trained by the patriarchy is to get back the power, whether it's the power in the home, whether it's power in society, whether it's power in politics. The patriarchy is a rejuvenating system, and we will see it trying to rejuvenate itself in all sectors.
Ranako, I just want to add to that last point that Marcus is making about the rejuvenating nature of the patriarchy. And in particular, I think we need to really have a laser focus on sexism, right? Because I think there's this very hostile sexism that exists, right? Easy to identify, right? We see this sort of contempt for women by some men, and the belittling of women that can be very systematic, such as in workplace policies, and connected to the violence and aggression that women experience on a day-to-day basis. It's easy to recognize that hostile sexism, but I think what we sometimes miss and what reinforces and rejuvenates the patriarchy is a benevolent form of sexism, right? So in response to the violence that we see on the newspaper, on TV, you would hear statements like, let's protect our women, it's the role, those are our mothers and our queens, and this is our empress, and putting women on a pedestal, And as long as she remains related to us, there's value to that woman. You know, and that whole language about protecting our women, you know, it's a very benevolent type of sexism that is also sexism, that also positions men in a place of power over women and over women's bodies and over women's decisions, that we also need to be critical about and reject. So I think it's moving, you know, it's really being able to recognize where and how patriarchy is rejuvenating itself within our own spaces and within our own ideologies that we may well intentionally express, right? So I think that's a great point that Marcus made there about patriarchy and how it always looks for spaces to keep, you know, sending its roots deeper and deeper.
Yes, and I do thank you both. You know, those are very crucial points that you've made. So, you know, we're about 12 minutes before we wrap up. So I would like to again ask if there are any questions, comments, contributions. Feel free to raise your hand if you're more comfortable putting it in the chat. You can feel free to do so. So as we, you know, final question, and if there are any questions, we will take as we see the questions as well. You know, what advice, Kevin and Marcus, would you give? What advice would you give to men and boys who are desirous of, you know, unlearning these gender norms and expectations that they have grown up and been socialized around, in order to develop healthier and a bit more positive expressions of masculinities?
Well, quickly, Kevin. So engaging with new ideas of masculinity, which usually borders into engaging with femininity and non-traditional ways of seeing manhood and boyhood, is very uncomfortable. And I think the first thing, and I think Ronald, remember we did a lot of work with when we were training these young men to think about their work in masculinities. A lot of the work was around pushing through the discomfort. I think collectively as men, and men who've already pushed through discomfort, I think we need to support other men to work through that discomfort that the patriarchy causes, whether it's shame, embarrassment, silencing. It is a responsibility for us as men to, and at least those who are gender and feminist conscious men, to help other men work through the discomfort of what the patriarchy is doing. So, you know, I think that there's a need for all of us men to kind of sit together and really talk about what has a system really done to us, right? We fight with men, we fight with women, and we think that immediate superficial relationship is all, but really and truly there's underlying core ideologies and systemic reasons for why we are in this position, right? But before we even get to unpacking that, we need to work through the discomfort, and we need to ask men to get to that place of uncomfortableness, right? Because then we know that they're starting to be exposed to the realities that exist out there, and that those realities aren't really part of their own expectations and their roles and what they want to be associated with, right? And we need to support them through that discomfort.
Yeah, if I had to pick one advice out of my list of advices for men entering this space, I think the one that rises to the top would be listening to the voices of women, right? Listening to women in your lives, in your home, trying to understand their impressions of us, trying to understand how they navigate sexism and microaggressions and violence on a day-to-day basis, how they deal with discrimination in the workplace and in other spaces. I'm listening to women. I think that has such a powerful impact for men and for boys in terms of beginning to break down those stereotypes that only male voices matter, and that men hold this position of power and are the ones who are supposed to ultimately teach and reproduce values in society. I'm working on a team right now that's organizing a really exciting event for during 16 days of activism against gender-based violence. It's called Womentorship, and it brings together women from multiple spaces, business, academia, activists, and we're creating this environment where they will be able to interact with adolescent girls and boys. You know, often the default thinking is, okay, let's have spaces for adult women to share and pass down information to younger girls, and adult men to share and pass down information to boys. I think there's so much value for men and for boys to really sit at the feet of women and learn, you know, and that would be my advice. Take some time, you know, first within your home and within your private spaces, to listen and really value, you know, the advice and the stories that you can get from the women and girls in your space. But also there are so many women who are excelling in different areas, you know, that we can learn a lot from. I think that's a huge step in moving the agenda for equality, gender equality forward in the Caribbean.
Yeah, and I think, you know, those are excellent pieces of advice. And, you know, as we wrap up again, I really want to thank Ronell, because even I think it was Thursday, through Life and Leggings and their initiative under redefining masculinities, a group of us, in terms of men, women's organizations, and academia, we would have had, a dinner and a conversation about some of the work that we're doing, and not only just some of the work that we're doing, but where we're going and what we would want to achieve and how we can do this together, understanding that, you know, it's not necessarily an isolated approach, but it has to be a holistic approach. Women and men, academia, everybody getting involved, to really get a grip and to really begin to dismantle patriarchy. So we've come to the end at this point. I really want to thank Kevin. I really want to thank Marcus for your amazing experience and how you were able to, you guys have so much experience, but how you were able to encapsulate all of your experience into these very actionable points, this very interesting conversation. And I really want to thank everybody who was here. We do apologize for the little Zoom hiccup that we had, but again, navigating the online space, these are some of the challenges that happened. And so at this time, I'll just turn back over to Ronald. Ronald?
Thank you, Ranako. I just want to begin by saying, again, thank you so much for filling in today and for the excellent job that you did in moderating. And, we worked together before, and we will continue to work together going forward in, advancing gender justice in the Caribbean. And so I just want to now just say thank you to Kevin and Marcus for taking the time, especially today, and seeing the vision and seeing why it was important to have this conversation on International Men's Day. I feel as though, as what you were saying, Kevin, in the conversation, it's such a missed opportunity on this day. Sometimes we end up, sometimes celebrating men just because they're men, as opposed to having the conversations, the necessary conversations that need to be had so that we can move forward together to achieve gender equality and to unpack, the systemic issues that disadvantage men and women and everybody else who are largely hidden or ignored in the conversation. All right. And again, special thanks to Marcus, because it is an ungodly hour where you are. And I appreciate you still saying yes, despite knowing that it would be such a ridiculous time where you are. So thank you so much for imparting the knowledge that you both have shared with us today. And I really hope that, persons were able to take away from the conversation pieces of nuggets of information that they can benefit from personally or within the spaces that they're in and share. The conversation was recorded. We will edit out the parts where the bots came in, and we would share it. And we would also share bits of points that you guys sort of shared that need to be centralized, obviously, and repeated for persons who were not able to attend today for whatever reason. But thank you again so very much, and we look forward to engaging with you again and continuing the work.
Everyone.